about every 6 months now, I find at least a couple of people who come up to me and say, hey, Fisk, I was told that if I got my associate's degree in criminal justice, if I then got a bachelor's in cybersecurity or a master's in cybersecurity, that there's so much demand for these kinds of positions and people that, I'll be guaranteed, $75,000 and up for a job, right? And that's what I want. Like, I need that security and stability. It's instead becoming something as marketed by, people who do certs, academic universities, and even, high school guidance counselors as a stable career option, right? As a you're going to make it kind of thing. And, as a result, the people who are coming into the field are very different now. Academia is almost like a canary in a coal mine to some extent, insofar as I think we need to be increasingly cautious in terms of cybersecurity, how it is that our security mechanisms shape our ability to do different kinds of work within a space. And to understand that cybersecurity is not simply a thing that we do to protect people inside of a university, is a space within which we do the work of a university, right? We're not simply securing something, we're setting the boundaries of what a university is and how it works. Can your kid sit through half an hour of 1970s Mr. Rogers? And if the answer is no, what's changed with kids and brains between now and then? Is it anything? And if not, then what is it that we're doing to our kids and our people that changes those attention spans and mechanism? And I say this really importantly, especially relative to a broader cybersecurity, because that lack of focus, that lack of attention, that lack of ability to slow down and take stock, to be attuned to the fast pace of the information world, right? That comes at a price.
So here's something pretty cool. Our guest today is literally reshaping how we think about cybersecurity education. Dr. Nathan Fisk isn't just teaching cybersecurity from some ivory tower. He's out there in communities working with high school kids and has even published books about internet safety. As one of only 5 people worldwide to be named a Fulbright cybersecurity scholar, Nathan also had a stint at the London School of Economics. Nathan, thanks for joining us on the Be Fearless podcast.
Glad to be here, John. Thanks for having me.
Well, let's talk a little bit about how you got here. And let's start at the beginning. How does someone end up becoming a cybersecurity solution expert? Was there a moment where you thought, this is it, this is what I want to do with my life?
It's such a complicated question, right? Like, definitely when it comes to like getting into cybersecurity and, getting into that kind of hacker space, right? I'm one of those millennial kids, like I'm like one of the eldest millennials. And, I'm one of that generation for whom Hackers, the movie, was a really big deal. Right. But I grew up in a, upstate New York town, not big access to big tech communities back then. And, reading things like Stephen Levy's Hackers and Bruce Sterling's, the Hacker Crackdown were all like very close texts to my heart. And, things that I really held on to as a kid was finding those early hacker communities, trying to become part of them, learning what it was to do this stuff. And, I was also that kid who, on the family PC had a, floppy disk of, 1,000, viruses and infected the entire computer and then, learned more than I ever have before or ever again. When my dad kind of walks up to me and goes, hey, I see all those viruses on the computer numbering in the thousands and you have 24 hours to fix it or you're dead. Go. And, that's how you learned that stuff back then. And it was then that I developed a deep love for technology and cybersecurity. But really back then, it wasn't about cybersecurity, which wasn't exactly a phrase. It was about hackers and hacking and learning to do that stuff and be a part of those communities. But, I was also one of those kids who was told like, oh, yeah, you're going to be making 6 figures before you even leave college. There's going to be jobs for miles. You'll always be employed. And then the dot-com bust happened and I graduated directly into it. So I kind of fell in with a bad crowd of social scientists and never really left. And started really getting interested, not just in the technology itself, but the way that technology interacted with people and communities and institutions in very different ways. And as a result, ended up doing a lot of work around specifically internet safety as that was coming up in the the late 2010s into the 2020s. And a lot of that work was a lot about really learning how it is that kids understand technology and cybersecurity, understanding that network of ideas. And so now today I find myself in a position where, I'm primarily tasked with answering one big question, which is how is it that we make more hackers? How do we make more cybersecurity talent? And that's really the core of what I'm doing now. But again, I think for so many of us, it's not really that linear path. It's kind of bouncing around through the opportunities that come, and you become the expert that you become over time. Even if I may have wanted to just be, a hacker and cybersecurity expert somewhere down the line, I'm now something very different.
It's interesting. I think that your experience and my experience are a little bit different. You being a millennial and me being Gen X. My son is also a millennial.
Yeah.
And his girlfriend's Gen Z, his fiance. And one of the things that was interesting, and I was telling my wife this the other day, is that when I was growing up with computers, it was a very solitary kind of pursuit, meaning that there wasn't a lot of resources. Kind of like in your background, the resources that were generally available to me were few and far between. I mean, basically computer magazines that I had to go 20, 30 miles to go get into a library to go find them, or to a bookstore, particular bookstore to find them. And we didn't have the internet to help us. We had a lot of bulletin board systems, and you were hoping that someone would know something that you didn't know. And that's how the community was back in the 80s and 90s. And I think that what's interesting is how we, again, and I was going to, say solitary kind of slow moving information is kind of like where I kind of grew up. But then with millennials and Gen Z, y'all are growing up in, the world of MMORPGs and a lot more teamwork and team building kind of communities. And again, also the access to computer and access to information is a lot greater. I mean, it definitely affects how I behave when I go to work. Yeah. And I imagine it's very much affects how millennials and Gen Z go to work. Have you seen any kind of differences between the generations and how they approach cybersecurity and information security? And
absolutely. And it's not, I wouldn't say it's even about necessarily just the approach, but it's what kind of knowledge you come in with and how you think about what technology is in the first place, right? And I think there's something to be said for that solitary mindset. But I think, and if you don't mind my asking, where did you grow up?
Houston, outside a place called Clear Lake near NASA Johnson Space Center.
Cool. So I think that a lot of if you didn't have one of those big hacking scenes nearby when you were in the 80s and the 90s, it was harder to kind of interface with that crowd. Back before 2600 had local meetups everywhere, and things were harder to get to, right? Finding access to that community was a more difficult thing. And I think very specifically that what we're looking at, the farther back in generations you go, the more things had to be up here in a lot of ways, right? You had to imagine the system and imagine the network and imagine the code and imagine what you were doing in a very different way. You had to hold state in a different way, right? You can kind of carry that forward in the way that the different technologies and access to it has kind of shaped different generations, right? And I think as a result, I don't want to go so far as to be we're getting stupider or something like that. But it does very much change how you imagine the work of interfacing with technology, right? So for me, it's much more, hands-on. It's much more about who you know and who you're talking to. It's much more about finding access to the information that I need, right? And that's second nature to me, rather than kind of loading it all up. A lot of what I'm doing is in the machine, right? And I think that you can see that start to happen more and more. And that's certainly going to happen as we progress through this AI era, right? You can kind of see the natural progression into that. And I think that's a thing to talk about. I have big concerns there, right? But nonetheless, especially if you look into Gen Z and things like that, and Gen Alpha at this point, I'll just say I run a high school cybersecurity summer camp. I have for the last, will be this coming year in 26, it'll be 10 years. And, with each successive year, what I find is that it's more and more difficult to find students who even understand the base concepts of what a file system is, what a network is, what a computer is and what the components are, how those things connect together, right? And that's because all of that has been abstracted away. And with each generation, you get kind of farther away from the bare metal, right? And we lose the kinds of approaches and mindsets that came from really having your hands in the guts of the machine in the same way, right? And I think that was there in previous generations and in different ways, because that was how you could do cybersecurity, how you could be a hacker, how you could interface with technology, right? And that changes generation by generation, the kinds of comfort zones that each of us have relative to technology. And I think that's evident in the way that, I talk to people in the community, and the way that they kind of have different kinds of struggles, right? When it comes to entering into the field and developing out that security mindset, the modern security mindset, which again changes over time. So yeah, absolutely, there's those generational differences. And I think the farther in distance you go, the bigger the difference tends to get. And the harder it is for, different generations to interface with each other as a result.
Yeah, it's very interesting. I think abstraction is a word that I would have used as well, because it's just, like you said, we're getting further and further away from the machine. And we have all these layers that are kind of sitting on top of each other that make it easier for you to interact with the technology. But it also, I definitely have had conversations with people, younger people and older people, just like, hey, that's just not how computers work. I mean, it's just, it's a byte. But again, what we're seeing is that there's tons and tons that a computer can do for you. And, the different ways that people interact with computers is somewhat amazing. But I do think it does change, I think it changes your brain. I noticed that my son is much more likely to interact with like random people, team building and those kinds of things, whereas I'm probably going to just brute force my way through a subject. I think that working in teams is much more powerful than working solo, right? Team is going to beat a solo person every time. And I think it's more applicable to being societal, right? You have that part where, it's like you're being part of society. You have to work in teams to go and kill a boss in World of Warcraft or whatever.
Yeah.
But at the same time, it's also somewhat isolating in how people are interacting with other people, because and I've definitely seen it in my career, finding that common ground and having those interactions with, younger cybersecurity professionals and younger people in general is different. It's different than other folks. I mean, I'm totally interested in hearing what you have to say about this. And
no, I mean, that idea of abstraction is really at the, I'll get a little bit theoretical nerdy at you for a second, right? But that's at the core of most of the things that I'm looking at right now. Very simply that, we can think about cybersecurity in terms of the skills and the techniques and the abilities that we develop out, right? Just solely in terms of your capabilities, right? And what you can do. And really, that's what a lot of certs and formal degree programs and all of these kinds of textbooks and, university degrees and boot camps, right? That's what those do, is that they are meant to be academically rigorous in ways that provide metrics that explain, what can you do in terms of KSTs or whatever, right? And that's useful and that's interesting. But what I'm finding very much is that as we abstract out, right, not just in terms of the technology itself, but the ways that we do the education, right? It's no longer about, hey, I'm hanging out with my buddy and we're at a 2600 meeting and we're just jamming on this piece of technology and we're breaking it and messing around with it and seeing how far we can push the limits because that's what we do and that's cool. Right. It's like hot rodding culture versus, buying a car at the store. Right. It's very different and very social. Right. And a big part of the work that I do now is really foundationally saying, well, if you don't have access to that community, then you don't have the same kind of approach and expertise and mindset that you would if you did. Right. And so, one of the big things I find right now, I'll go out to and do, I do presentations all over the place and often students are in those spaces. And, I about every 6 months now, I find at least a couple of people who come up to me and say, hey, Fisk, I was told that if I got my associate's degree in criminal justice, if I then got a bachelor's in cybersecurity or a master's in cybersecurity, that there's so much demand for these kinds of positions and people that, I'll be guaranteed, $75,000 and up for a job, right? And that's what I want. Like, I need that security and stability. And those people are not necessarily people who are, I'm full bore into this hacker community and I'm in here because I care about it. And like, this is super cool and all my friends are here, right? It's instead becoming something as marketed by, people who do certs, academic universities, and even, high school guidance counselors as a stable career option, right? As a you're going to make it kind of thing. And, as a result, the people who are coming into the field are very different now, and they have a different approach to why they're doing what they're doing. It's not so deeply personal anymore, right? And so a big part of my argument is that without access to communities who are like completely into this, where, you're cool if you can find like a new way to break something or do something, or something's particular, like you develop that adversarial mindset, not just as something that you do, but as something that you do with other people, right? And so if you can't cultivate that culture, if you can't cultivate that community, if you can't bring people to that at the same time as you're developing those formal skills and techniques, you have a very different kind of person that actually looks a lot more like an engineer than they do a hacker or a cybersecurity professional.
Very interesting. I mean, I think I noticed this a couple of decades ago. Right. Maybe in a couple of decades, maybe not quite 2 decades ago. I noticed that, because at the time that this realization somewhat happened to me, I was working with the military back in like the 2010, somewhere in that time period. And one of the things that I noticed is that there were, particularly in the military, they have like the ASVABs. And people would answer a bunch of questions and do whatever, and they would be, pushed into this, MOS, and I remember talking to someone who was put in cybersecurity, and they didn't really care about technology. It was just like a job that they got.
Yep.
And I think that was a completely different experience. Again, I think both for me and you is that to be involved with computers and be involved with technology and the hacker community, we had to pursue it. Persistence conquers resistance, right? We had to be passionate about it.
Yep. And
whereas the professionals that are coming in today, like you're saying, they're kind of being told that there's a guidance counselor or a friend of theirs that is telling them that, hey, this would be a good career path, or maybe they're looking at like the, top paying jobs, and they're saying, hey, maybe this is a job that I can, do. And they're just not bringing the passion to it. Right. And I think
I mean, relative to that military context, too. Right. Because, I have my own interfaces with the military these days and, just conversations with those folks in that space. And I'll just say, like, one of the things that they're starting, like a conversation I had, with some special forces folk, just looking at this and saying, well, yeah, we do all this testing to see what you're going to be good at. And then we do all this training on the back of that testing after we've done your aptitude testing. And then we end up with somebody who like may have never cared from the beginning and hates what they do and will do anything to get out of doing it. Right. And that's the wrong thing. You can't have that way. And again, I think part of the issue here is that we have very poor ideas and concepts and language for talking about these things that are very concrete, opposite of abstract, right? They're very personal and human and social, right? And it's not just about passion. It's not just about like, oh, I'm really into this stuff, right? That's a function of having access to a culture and community that does that. That's a function of, getting into it with people in exciting ways. And if you don't have that, then you end up training up people who hate what they do, who never wanted to do it. And you're wasting a whole ton of money developing out a professional that doesn't want to be there at the end of the day. And I think that's tremendously difficult. And I think even beyond whether or not we're training the right people for the right jobs, I think there's a secondary issue insofar as that's becoming unsustainable, as most people most of the time are now trying to devise ways to find those people, that talent that has that drive and interest and passion. And so, again, talking to those same folks, which often happen to be women, who come to me and are like, hey, I got these degrees. Why can't I get a job? They go into the interview room and they get asked things like, instead of like, can you do X, Y, or Z, or how would you solve this problem? It's like, what's in your home lab? And what's the last con you went to? What's the last competition you've been in? What have you done for the community lately? And, these folks who come out of those traditional spaces and have no idea that any of that stuff even exists. Like, what community? What's a home lab? There are competitions? What's a CTF, right? They don't even know that those things exist because those are elements of the culture and community, not elements of the formal education. And so, again, like we are pushing these very abstracted notions of education and getting the kinds of people that, we asked for.
Incredibly interesting. I have lots of observations, but I think one of what you were saying is, as you were kind of going through it, what happened to me is I started thinking about vocation, right? Yeah. For me, it's a vocation. Meaning, I'm looking, and I just did a search. It's like a summons or strong inclination to a particular state or course of action.
Absolutely.
Right? Okay. And then as opposed to an occupation, which is the work in which a person is employed. And these are two completely different, hopefully your vocation, your occupation can come together and you're like, really kind of motivated to be passionate about the work and understand like what's going on. So I think vocation is important. It would be awesome if everyone had that calling, or that you gave them the opportunity through your testing and some training that happened, and that passion or that desire to be in the community existed. What I've seen is that most of the folks that are coming into it today, it is an occupation. They went and they got a undergraduate degree in cybersecurity. And these are questions I ask. If I am interviewing, I'm like, so what projects have you been working on? What do you do in your spare time? Right.
Yep.
And it's like, if it's CTFs and home labs and reading, hacker magazines and those kinds of things, then you're probably on the vocation path. I will have to do a lot to kind of motivate you to kind of get your job done, as opposed to what I'm seeing again today is a lot more folks that are, come to the work, they go and they do the work. They don't really understand how important their work in vulnerability management is, or security operations, or threat intelligence is to how you defend an enterprise. Yeah. And they kind of approach it from I go to work and I do my job and whatever. And then they might have like, aspirations for being a social media influencer or whatever, something else that's not cybersecurity.
And I'll just share with you, right, that one of the things that I find myself talking about very frequently, even, a good friend of mine and colleague, Dr. John Cluck, also we went to the same PhD program together, except he's much more medical anthropologist and focuses in a lot of those kinds of spaces. I mean, just the other day we were having a conversation and he's like, look, we really got to start thinking about this as if like, why aren't we looking at doctors, right? Why don't we look at those modes of education, right? And doctors, again, highly technical field, high degrees of variability and complexity in their everyday work, lots of gut calls, lots of very similar kinds of issues, right? And lives on the line, right? We're not talking about like, oh no, my data center went down and a couple customers went out. Like we're talking about people are dying here, right? And they don't do their education in the same ways. Like it is very much, you got to get in there. You got to be next to a doctor all day long. You got to hang. You got to know what it is. It's not just about like going home after work when you're in your residency, right? You are eating, breathing, and living it every second of the day. And that cultivates a culture, right? And if we're not cultivating that culture actively and implicitly, right, then we are just merely pushing it off to the side and acting as if it doesn't matter in terms of the education and the talent we get back. And so Agreed. I think very much so we need to be careful about how it is that we educate cybersecurity professionals relative to that access to the community. And I take hope in some ways insofar as, I think a lot of universities have really embraced the CTF model. There's the, my good friend Jake Mihavec over at MBCC, like started the NCAEC Cyber Games, right? Big collegiate competition that's much more accessible than a lot of them are. and really trying to open those doors to community. And that, I'll just say here and now, that's what the 502 project is all about. It's about opening up those doors to the community and making it accessible for everyone, no matter who you are. And I don't mean that in a diversity and inclusion sense. I mean that in a it doesn't matter where you are along the chain in terms of your skill and ability or what it is that you're trying to do in cybersecurity, because that doesn't matter inside of the community, right? What matters is that you have access to an incredibly broad network of people who are trying to solve similar or adjacent challenges, who are trying to learn skills at the same pace. And, again, a tiny example of this is, you've got a high school teacher who doesn't know half as much as the high school kid who is basically breaking into X, Y, and Z thing over here, knows the dark web and is hanging around with all those people. And you have a high school teacher who maybe at best has been hired to teach business, right? And again, they both need to learn something, and they need to learn something from each other in a real sense. But unless you can put them in a kind of a community where they can see each other as having value, right, equally as co-community members, then you don't have the same kind of relationship and experience and exchange there. And so not everything can be simply about these formal training and education relationships, because bluntly, when you do that, you get, again, in the cybersecurity space, you get engineers, you get computer scientists, you get IT folks, right? And that's not the same thing. And again, I even to your earlier point about cyber degree programs, I have talked to folks for whom they're just yeah, you got a cyber degree? I'm not interested in talking to you, right? You took the thing that is the wrong pathway. You took the thing that, again, I'm looking for the guy who went into IT and then started to realize that cybersecurity is a path. I'm looking for the guy who went to CS and now does vulnerability testing, right? And those people have a vastly different skill set and the hunger for the knowledge and participation in that community, right?
Right. And, I would love to think that the cybersecurity degree is something that gives you the basic skills. But again, it goes back to the passion about it and the vocation of it. And like you were saying about doctors, I think was an interesting approach, is that a lot of people that come into it with the cybersecurity degree, they come into thinking that it is a 9-to-5 job. They don't see it as I remember having a conversation with somebody, and they decided that they wanted to be in the SOC. That's where their interests were. But they also wanted a quality of life. And this is, someone that was beginning their journey in cyber.
Yeah.
And I thought it was the craziest thing that they didn't understand that they were in an incident response role, that they were in a SOC, and that there were going to be events that happened that you needed to investigate. And that work was incredibly important to defending the business. And that they thought that they were going to have, a 40-hour work week.
Right.
Which, hey, I hope that that's the case. But at the same time, there are going to be times where it's hands on deck, and that someone needs to be looking at that work and making sure it's done well, and that it's important. And that stressed this person out greatly.
Oh, yeah.
And I think that what I told him is, I was like, it's like you decided to be a fireman, but you didn't want to, go take care of a fire when the fire was happening. You wanted it to happen between this time and that time, and that no one was going to look at your work and say that you put out the fire correctly, because that's what these are. These are little fires. And and again, it kind of shocked me that they thought that was not the way it was going to be, as opposed to your doctor analogy, where you're, doing your residency, you're going through the hospital, you're doing that work, and it's challenging. There are lots of people that drop out of residency programs.
Absolutely.
Because their passion isn't there. And it's not to say there's anything wrong with them, but if you're going to do something as important as practice medicine, you want people that are dedicated to the activity. As ridiculous as it may sound, me saying this, I think you want the same kind of people in your cybersecurity program.
Absolutely.
And you can tell whether you have a good cybersecurity team in just their measures of what do they do on their own time, right? Are they getting involved with CTFs? Are they looking to participate in communities? And not like Black Hat and DEF CON, even though I would include those inside the community. But I'm saying just, in Houston Security Conference or some other conference that's local to them.
Are you going to B-Sides? Do you even know B-Sides exists, right?
Right. And again, it's those kinds of activities that kind of let you know, are these people passionate about it? Are they growing a culture of passion? And that has everything to do with whether or not you're going to have a successful cybersecurity program at your company. Definitely, I wouldn't think that IT leaders think about this. I definitely don't think business leaders are thinking about it, but it is a good barometer to say that, do you have a program that's going to be sustainable?
Yeah.
Is if if your cybersecurity team is involved in CTFs, B-sides, community, are they interested in sharing with you what technologies that they've been playing with? And they did a side project and then they're showing it to the CISO. If you see those activities, you probably have a program that's on the right track that is going to build on its own. Yeah. Right? Without you having to interject a lot of incentives and training programs and other kinds of stuff into your program. Right?
Yeah.
Would you agree with that, or would you?
Absolutely. And I mean, to that very point, right? And I want to go back to the SOC point too for a second, as a kind of a flip side of what we just talked about. But just relative to that, like, part of what I'm really saying here is that that's not just simply about cybersecurity education or technical education, right? That's how we think about what education is, right? That it's very individual, very personal. You know, one of the best things I ever saw was in cybersecurity education, a nonprofit group called Hui Huao. Out of Hawaii, taking groups of, just out of high school kids, often, kids who don't have a lot of opportunities, and just grabbing those kids and saying, hey, look, we will train you up on, electronic security, alternative energy production, these big skills that'll prepare you for accepting government security contracts, right? And one of the big things that they said as part of building that out, not as part of a formal educational institution, right, is they said that every time we have a cohort, nobody graduates until everybody graduates. And what that does is it forges these bonds, right, between people who ultimately are your network when you get out there in the industry, right? And that if one of you succeeds, then all of you succeed to some extent. And so for relative to IT and cybersecurity hiring practices, you're looking for those folks that are connected to the community, not just because they have a very different approach and very different mindset. Their skill set can look different. Their perseverance can look different, right? But beyond that they are a feeder because they know and have access to the communities where the talent lives. And it's no longer about like having HR go out and be like, well, did you get your A+ cert, right? You formally met the conditions for this position. Instead, it's that kind of thing that we've always talked about, right? The person-to-person networking, being part of a community, being able to say like, no, I met this guy at B-Sides the other day. I watched them do this thing. And like that solved X, Y, and Z problems for us in this company just by watching that. And now we want to bring them in, right? And it's that kind of informal process, right, that the community really excels at. And what we're kind of building in some ways are almost two separate groups of individuals, the people who have access to these communities, right? Whether those are the straight shot hacker communities or often the professional communities that live on like Black Hat and the folks who stay out of DEF CON, right? But it is very much, do you have a person that is bringing a network with them? Do you have a person that cares enough to find those networks? And if you do, then again, you are doing a very different kind of recruiting and you're doing a very different kind of talent search, right? And to that point too, I think we also have a bit of a problem with the way that we market a lot of these positions, even for those like folk who for it is a vocation, right? Because we do churn those folks out too, right? There's lots of those folks. I see those kids all the time. These like deeply passionate kids who are just like, I know what a penetration tester is. I want to be that. I want to break into a building. I want to break into some stuff. I want to do something cool, right? And then they hit the flat wall of, oh yeah, by the way, 90% of these positions are SOC. And they're like, well, this is not what I expected, and nor do I want this, right? And so in both directions, we kind of bounce out those deeply connected community members, like at the lower levels. Up in the higher tiers, it's kind of expected that you've got a network, you've got enough experience, you build tacitly a network and a culture just by being part of an organization, right? They become the community, but we could have those people ready to go much earlier on because these aren't static components of like our cyber ed landscape. we can facilitate these communities. We can drive these communities. We can build that passion. We can make it so that these people have that very deeply culturally rooted adversarial mindset. And those are things that we can achieve. We can do that stuff. It's just not very frequently that kind of work is not about abstraction. It's not about textbooks. It's not about metrics. It's not about degrees. It's about the people you know and the people that you hang with and the way that you talk and the way that you think. And that's harder to get down into and scale, I think, in a lot of ways. And as a result, it tends to drop out of a lot of these formal degrees, formal programs, formal education. And again, it's that abstract versus the concrete that I'm just laser focused on these days.
Yeah, I think the people that I know that are best in cybersecurity today, they don't have degrees.
Yep.
They just have passion, and they're just kind of moved up through the ranks just because they were interested.
And often they have better stories and better backgrounds, right?
Absolutely.
They, it's not just that they're a cyber professional, it's that they were 5 other things before they got there. And that expertise plays out, right, in the cyberspace.
Yeah, the ones that I'm talking about were, IT people first. They were on a help desk. They were in IT. They were doing something completely different. And then they kind of like fell into cybersecurity. And those people are the ones that kind of understand how the technology works. They understand what's going on. They understand like the bigger landscape of other than, hey, I know how to use these, particular cybersecurity tools or whatever. And they understand more about the context of what's going in there.
One of my favorite books is a book called, it's super, super dull sounding and incredibly boring, right? It's a book called Talking About Machines, and by an anthropologist by the name of Orr. And this book is an anthropological study of Xerox copier repair people at Xerox PARC in the 90s. Completely boring, but anybody who's ever worked IT, right? The moment you crack this book, you're like, I know what this is, and I know exactly who these people are because they are me. He talks about like you ask these very blunt anthropological questions like, well, are you using the manual to diagnose this problem? The answer is no, but to have somebody articulate that and explain why is tremendously valuable. So like, part of this book is, do you use the manual to diagnose these copier problems? And people are like, no, I don't use the manual. Why would I do that? Right. I walk over to the trash can, which is a living archive of the problems that this copier has faced. I can see every single time a user has had a problem just by digging through the trash in order. And then I can get a timeline for what's been going on in this machine. And then I can diagnose the problem because I know what those things on the printed page look like. And I know how that translates into technical breakdowns, right? And that's not just about an understanding of the technology itself. It's about understanding the context of that technology, how it works in process, how it works in the workflow, right? And then the complexities that you have to kind of route through to deal with these incredibly difficult problems, right? And it's that gut kind of instinct that you only build by literally having tools that have the shape of your hand wrapped around them, right? It is that deeply concrete, instinctual kind of work that you only see in, I think, the top tiers of cybersecurity professionals, right?
Yeah. Well, let's talk about the 502 project a little bit. You're the founder. Tell me about it. What inspired you to start the 502 project?
I mean, I'll be really honest. First starting point is really grounded. I talked about that cybersecurity summer camp, our USF cyber camp program. I started that 9 years ago now. We had our 9th run this past a couple weeks ago. One of the things that always bothered me about cyber camp programs was that, these universities in particular, people, the faculty members getting up and going, oh yeah, come on and bring your kids in here. We'll take them from zero to hacker in 1 week and they'll be able to go out and be ready for all these cybersecurity. No. That is absolutely not real. There is no world in which, especially with each successive year, that you're going to take a kid who has been raised on tablets, right? And you're going to be like, oh, hey, did you even know a file system exists? Did you know what files are, right? Do you know how to conceptualize data in that way? Have you ever even opened a computer, right? No. None of that, right? So you are starting from scratch if you are real about wanting to interface with kids who know nothing, right? And honestly, a lot of those kids are the kids who have had the least opportunity and the least advantage. And weirdly, those kids have the right mindset already. They're hungry. They want to go break some stuff. They just don't know what to do, right? and they don't know how to think about it. So in a situation like that, when you have a lot of hungry, interested kids who don't know how to take the next step, and there's no world where in 1 week you're going to give them all the foundations they need to even think about what hacking really is, right? The best thing that you can do is to bring them into a community, because you've only got 1 week, but a community is a lifetime, right? And so even in our cyber camp program, my core goal, I don't really care if I teach any of these kids anything. That's not the point, right? It's not about the education. It's about instantiating them inside of a local community of cybersecurity professionals who do this stuff. And as a result, my goal isn't to teach people. It's to make sure that every single one of those kids has a LinkedIn profile, that they connect to all of the cyber professionals and all of the students that they meet inside of our camp program, to even show them that they can be those people. Like, hey, you want to have an opportunity to present in front of these, like, the CISO of this, cyber company? Do you want to go hang with like somebody from the Talos group? Cool. Like, let's make that happen. And in that way, if you refocus the way that you think about that kind of program, it stops being about whether or not you're teaching them something and testing them and the metrics that they get on the other side, and starts being about, well, how do we use challenges and tools and things to drive interest and excitement in these fields, right? How do we make this, again, like almost like a conference table? How do we take this really cool stuff, litter it all over the table, and so that not just the kid that you're trying to reach, but the cyber professional in the room goes, oh, this is really cool. Like, let me show you how to do that, right? That's the point, is to build those connections, to share that passion, the enthusiasm of the people who are in it now. And so the camp program really became that over time, where it was less of a camp program and more of a professional networking event that we threw a whole bunch of high school kids into the middle of, right? So the 502 project really carries from that. And in fact, there's like kind of one like moment in the cyber camp program that I was just like, oh, we got to do something. And that was, this one young woman. She had been a part of the camp for, I think it was her third year. And I knew her well. We had a great rapport. And she comes, this little kid, like, comes running up to me. Dr. Fisk, I'm so glad to be here again. Like, I can't wait for cyber camp this year. I'm like, awesome. And I'm like, I'm so glad you are back because you're cool. I look at her, I go, hey, but look, and this is before the camp was we're way more dynamic now. But like back then, it was the same stuff every year. And, I go, look, we're going to be doing the same challenges. We're going to be doing the same kind of stuff. We're going to be doing the same kind of things. Like, if you're bored, you let me know, and I'm going to pull one of these scary hackers over here, and they're going to give you a challenge, right? And she just looks at me and she goes, nah, Dr. Fisk. She goes, I don't remember anything we did last year. And I don't remember anything we did the year before that. She goes, I don't get to do cybersecurity all year long. She goes, I only get to do it here. And so I'm excited to be back to do cybersecurity now. And she goes, even beyond that, she goes, I love all of the people here, and this is my chance to hang out with these people, right? And it was at that moment that I thought, well, look, all we've got to do is take programs like this, the camp programs, the boot camps, the trainings, the anything that we can find, the cybersecurity clubs, the competition groups, right? Everywhere we do that, we build community. We build local community even. And if we can take that and interface with those small communities all over the place and use them as feeders into a giant national network, then what we've built is a very accessible cybersecurity community that's online and persistent and allows folks who are interested in cybersecurity for a variety of reasons to have access to the kinds of people that they're looking for. And that's not just about having kids that have access to cyber professionals. That's also about cyber professionals having access to kids in ways that allow them to feel like they're giving back, right? To have those meaningful connections, to have those relationships that people are looking to have as part of being a part of this real community. So the 502 project is exactly that. We basically, the 502 project is itself kind of a joke. It's the HTTP error code for bad gateway, because we are a bad gateway to the cybersecurity community, of course. And that's really how we've built, is, finding our way into these different local communities and different kind of events, being the kind of social and digital backbone for those events, and then bringing everyone who's a part of that into our larger community. And with that, you get your own local community, and you get access to this national community. And that has actually had really interesting kind of secondary carryover effects as we start to think about, well, what's going to happen with AI, how do we protect and secure local communities? And so now, like, we've built the community, we've got more and more people coming in all the time. And now we're starting to build on the back of that to ask questions like, well, all right, look, if we've got a local area where we have, a CISO from a utility company, if we've got, representatives from law enforcement, if we've got researchers, if we've got, small and medium businesses represented, and we've got these students and educators at the same time, right? How do we pull these people together and say, let's just answer one really tough question to crack? How do we take these students who are interested and want to do something, and how do we give them real world experience that connects them to actual cyber and security professionals doing that work on the ground? So yeah, that's the 502 project in a nutshell, but it's very much just grounded in those conversations and experiences straight out of Cybercamp. And again, like, how do you build and facilitate community that then builds the passion that allows people to be self-sustaining, as opposed to pushing them with metrics and often highly abstracted, notions into doing things that they honestly don't really want to do. They just want, a stable paycheck.
Right. I think that's allowing, practitioners in the industry that have experience to be able to give back. I think a lot of them want to give back. I think they just don't know how.
Yeah. It's an equal and big problem. Like, Cybercamp, we get all these folks in who are like, hey, yeah, I really want to help out. And you can see almost the people, right? The vocational folks versus the non-vocational folks in that exact moment. Because, I joke about Cybercamp. I run it with a guy who's a former, Hillsborough County high school educator, like, knows how to run a classroom, knows how to run logistics, knows how to do discipline. And he and I are kind of like, I joke that we're the two fists of Cybercamp. Julian is the law and order, and I am the chaos. And in that, right, we often come to these meetings together with people who want to come in and do work with the Cybercamp. And like, I'll jump in and I'll be like, hey, look, I'll be honest with you folks. It's whatever you want it to be. You tell me what you think is cool, and I will make it happen in our camp. And if you can fly with that, then like, let's talk. And half of the people are kind of like, yeah, I know what I'm going to do. Like, give me this and this and this and this, and we're going to do this cool thing, right? And then the other half of the people are like, can you give me more details on what exactly it is that you are looking for? How long do I have to present? And do I need a slide deck of X number of slides? And I just got, we do not want a slide deck, right? We don't want that kind of stuff. That's not what we're doing here. What we're doing is trying to do cool stuff that brings kids closer to you. I remember the very first year of Cybercamp, I had a undergraduate student, part of our White Hatters Cybersecurity Club at USF, and he was going to do a presentation on reverse engineering to high school students. And he goes through this like 60 slide deck. And by the end of it, every single student was playing Minecraft or was asleep. At the end of the day, I just go, hey man, like, Ian, like, look, like, I know you love this stuff, right? And he's like, yeah, it's like the best thing there is. And I go, I know you think it's cool, but how did you learn how to do it? And he goes, oh, like, I learned a couple of things in class, but then I started talking to people and playing with it at home and like checking this resource out and doing this competition. And like one thing led to another. And this is like who I am. And I go, Ian, that's not how you taught these kids. Like, where did you get that slide deck? And he goes, oh, he goes, that came from my professor. And that's how I was taught. And I go, did you like that? And he goes, no, it was really boring. Oh, and then he like the dawning comes on it. And again, it's not, it sounds obvious, right? But we've all been trained to teach in these ways. We've all been trained to pipe up a slide deck and talk, right? But that's not the only way to learn. And I think especially the folks in the hacker community know deeply that it's not about being talked at by an expert. It's about getting your hands in the machine and hanging with other people doing the same thing. So
I agree. Like we were saying earlier, I think that, we talked a little bit how folks have kind of taken a tests and got themselves into a program and a technical degree, maybe in cybersecurity. I think what I'm hearing you say is that what's important is the community, it's the vocation, it's the passion of the work. Bring all this together so that you can have a good career, but also a fulfilling career.
Absolutely.
People are going through these degree programs and they are complaining about the lack of jobs. Every job that I've had, and I think you'll probably agree with this, every job I've had has really been because of someone I know.
It's 100%.
Been about community. And when these graduates are lamenting about the lack of jobs, despite having multiple certifications, degree in cybersecurity, I mean, succinctly, what's your advice for them?
It's very easy for them, right? It's find those communities. If this isn't a thing that you love, try to find out how to love it first, right? Read some history, read some, like, part of this too. It's not just about the people, it's about the culture, right? And if you find it difficult to find your way into the community, if you find it difficult to do that, do some reading, do some like watch hackers and war games, read the Cuckoo's Egg, read any of the newer stuff like Sandworm, right? Like, or Code War. Like, take a look at some books that talk about these communities. And because, you look historically and a lot of them really were, and you begin to understand and have an appreciation for, what that community is and why it matters. But you have to cultivate that interest and that passion. And it's easier to do with other people for most people, right? And so, go to B-sides, aggressively ask questions, like find somebody that you think is cool and like just talk with them, right? And that for a lot of people is really difficult to do. And it's even doubly difficult to do if like the kinds of people that hang at places like B-sides and DEF CON aren't the kinds of people that you are. And so it can be really difficult. And I just encourage everyone at that point to, whether you're a high school student or an adult transitioning between, workforces, you've got to find those people who are doing what you want to do. And you have to work with them. But it's not so hard these days. It's just so simple to find a Discord channel with people who are talking about what you want. You just have to be, and this is the really important part. And I think part of the problem with how we think about education, it's that we've really instilled in people that asking questions is a problem, and that asking questions is evidence of your lack of knowledge, not something that we do as part of working together in education. And so there are just so many people these days who are afraid of looking like they don't know and they don't belong simply by asking people, hey, how do I get started in this? Like, I don't even know what I'm looking at. Like, what is a command line, right? Like, that's intimidating and scary, not just because the technology is, difficult to wrap your head around, but because the people who love and care about this stuff can often be difficult to deal with. And so again, find those people, find the people that you can really connect with, and then ask questions aggressively. Like, don't let people go if you don't know the answer. Don't let people go if you need to know more, right? That's really the core of what being one of these professionals is. And I think is applicable to almost any highly technical field where you really can't know everything yourself. And you need to build a network to make it. But I think also I think we need to do better facilitating of that in almost all of our formal spaces as well. That's not just down to people who are the students who are trying to get in. It can't be. It has to be part of a coordinated effort. If we want these kinds of talent, then how do we facilitate those kinds of communities at scale, right? And you can already see like how major tech companies are doing exactly that kind of work, like out at DEF CON and running these parties and like, come on into this space. Like, that's active facilitation of networks and communities that benefit the organization. And so, again, we need to cultivate that at scale at a national level, or we're not going to have the kinds of talent that we need to do that kind of security work. And I'll connect this into a much broader context. If you look over at what's going on in, China, right? You have these entire communities sprouting up, that people living together who are hackers, right? Who came from nothing to do this work adversarially as a nation state. And again, I don't think that we're not talking about something that's as simple as, how do I get a job? we're talking about something that is, again, if we don't pay attention to the way that other people are doing this and they are cultivating these communities as part of a national security strategy, then we're missing the point in some ways. And again, our degree programs won't save us alone. They're going to give us people who they know how to do it. But there's a secondary question of, will they do it? And not just will they do it on the 9 to 5? Will they do it because they care and they want this and they know what they're protecting and they want that like as part of who they are as an individual? I think it's not just about like what you do as a student. Those students ought to be looking at all of us and being like, well, why aren't you helping me get in? Right? Because it's on everybody. So yeah, I'll get off my soapbox briefly there.
No problem. So the University of South Florida serves around 50,000 students. From an education standpoint, what are the biggest risks when it comes to cybersecurity in universities?
That's a tough one. And I think I'm going to give a non-traditional answer here. And that's very much out of my, I cut my teeth doing IT security and communications and training at the Rochester Institute of Technology. And I've been in and out of, academic circles almost my entire career. And I'll say there that, academic universities represent a very specific kind of network, although increasingly less so, where I think one of the big commitments, especially when it comes to university, is access to information, the ability to experiment, the ability to do interesting things that are often open and accessible, right? And I think, you look back at the 90s and you look at those early days of the ways that like university campuses began rolling out like student body wide access to, a network, right? And back then, those conversations were often driven by faculty members who were saying things like, we need to have an open information network because those are the commitments of what a university is. Like the network itself has to match our like informational commitments. This is a space where there is an exchange and openness, right? And as a result, our security needs to make sure that we've held on to that, right? And I think through the years, that has demonstrated itself to be a massive vulnerability and an incredible difficulty for university spaces to hang on to because openness means you're vulnerable. And I think we need to be in that regard. I think that, academia is almost like a canary in a coal mine to some extent, insofar as I think we need to be increasingly cautious in terms of cybersecurity, how it is that our security mechanisms shape our ability to do different kinds of work within a space. And to understand that cybersecurity is not simply a thing that we do to protect people inside of a university, is a space within which we do the work of a university, right? We're not simply securing something, we're setting the boundaries of what a university is and how it works. And I think that we're going to find through these practices in terms of cybersecurity that really we need to be careful and cautious to align those forms of security alongside of workplace practices to ensure that we can do the kinds of very human work that we need to get done. And in that regard, like I'm always kind of, I'm very practical, right? Like end of the day, you got the right solution and we can run on it now, then great. But I look at something like zero trust and like those kinds of mindsets and I'm like, yeah, that's really strong. But how does that translate down into human practices? And how does that translate into the kind of work we can do, especially if we're looking at something like a university? And again, I say this from the perspective of, having gone from a time, I remember back at RIT in the early 2000s, you could jack in a computer like anywhere on the entire network. You get an internet connection like that off to like some major pipeline and nobody cared, right? Like there was security, but that was the point. Like anybody can get on anytime. And that's the idea behind that kind of network. All the way to now as a faculty member where, I ask a simple question like, how does one, stand up a web page on this campus? And the answer is you don't, right? Unless that's centrally managed, get out of here. Like you're not going to stand up some weird hacker server for your high school kids, right? That's oh, whoa, you're going to do what? Kind of question now. And again, it's not that I don't understand why, but that we need to, from that perspective, be cautious about how the cybersecurity work that we do foundationally shapes and changes our workflows. across the board. So
very good. Yeah, I think that when we discuss networks, right, and I think the open mindset was, hey, let's make sure everyone has access to information.
Right.
It needs to match the ethos of the school. Let people do what they want to do, right? And then on the cybersecurity side, it was always, what about this? What about this? What about this? Security, right? Security. They're like, well, why would someone do that? Well, I don't know why they would do that. They did, but for whatever reason, they have an interest and they just, get into trouble. But you're also, identifying that, hey, this has kind of gone to the opposite extreme,
right?
Where the accessibility of technologies that would allow you to build better outcomes for your students and your community are being kind of closed off because of bureaucracy and security as well. And there's always a balance, right? There's always a balance between risk and reward, but people do need to have a safe place to build communities, especially in a university atmosphere. But it is a challenge. I think that universities not had enough investments in them and with respect to security. So you have if you can't make the investments, then it's hard for you to make security happen without being draconian.
Yeah.
Right. So
exactly.
And so if you want better outcomes, then you have to make the investment so that you can have the right security team that allows the security to happen, but also reduces bureaucracy and allows people to get their job done. I mean,
where's the sandbox, right? Like if the sandbox isn't the network itself, which it doesn't need to be, right? It doesn't have to be that. Then where's the sandbox, right? Where do you give students a place to play, right? And again, I think that's not just simply about like security in terms of, how universities run IT, right? That's also a function of the products that are being released, like especially at those budget tiers, right? Increasingly locked down machines that you are glued together and don't have replaceable components, right? There's no longer the same kind of ability, like whether we're talking about the network or whether we're talking about the machines themselves, there's no longer the same capability to open it up. And again, like per the hacker ethic, can you get your hands in the guts of the machine? And if the answer is no, then again, like not a problem necessarily, but we need to be very cautious in terms of how it is that represents a kind of educational strategy, a pedagogy, right? And as a result, we have to ask ourselves real questions. If education is nothing other than a giant technology by which we make particular kinds of people, right? How is it that particular pedagogical strategies lead to particular kinds of professionals? And in that vein, like if we take the sandboxes away, if we take the openness away, if we take the play away, right? If that doesn't get to happen here, then how do we cultivate it somewhere else with the acknowledgement that what we just did was change the pedagogy? Like we changed the educational strategy in a meaningful sense, not in ways that faculty might think about, but in ways that students absolutely care about. Again, like so many, if you look back in the history of hacking, right, that it is about academia. It is about like undergraduate kids at MIT who are just screwing around, right?
Yeah,
and by playing around, they learn all this stuff. And that's it, right?
Absolutely. All right. Well, let me ask one final question before we end. It's 2025, and we're still trying to figure out how to stay safe online. What's the one thing you think we absolutely have to get right in cybersecurity education moving forward?
The biggest thing is this, and it's been for insiders in internet safety and digital citizenship, whatever you want to call it these days, right? Staying safe out there, right? It's been long since that we've given up talking about things like, pornography and bullies and predators and the people that are the strangers that you meet online, right? Those are challenges, right? But they're not the big ones anymore. It's more about how it is that you kind of cultivate kids, right, who feel safe and confident operating in the everyday global online environment that they're going to find themselves in, to have a confidence in doing that. And in that way, it's very much like, raising a kid in a city who can go to the subway by themselves and find their way across town without a cell phone, right? And that is kind of the idea behind that right now, insofar as you're not the person, if you're a parent, right? You're not the person saying, hey, no, you just did something really bad and now you're off for like a month, right? That instead you're the person who, when a kid finds something that disturbs them or is an issue or that they need help with, that they can come to you and say like, hey, like, what do I do, right? and that they trust you enough to do that. And that takes a very careful cultivation of a relation. I think even more worryingly, though, now is that I think that parents need to be very careful about a highly antagonistic and aggressive media landscape writ large. And that, if we take AI as like an anchor, right, for what all of these kids are going to be living and working with in all likelihood, then we need to be really careful about how our kind of media landscape prepares kids for interfacing with those kinds of technologies. And, I'm a parent of young kids. It's been really interesting to be like a, internet safety and digital citizenship, cybersecurity kind of person raising young kids who are going to have to be online, right? Again, I'm going to say this, zero judgment for any parent out there. Like, none of this is your fault, and we have very little options, right? We're all trying to do our best. Like, I tend to talk about today in presentations with parents. I'm like, are your kids watching Cocomelon, right? Like, and for those of you who don't know, Cocomelon is this new educational kind of educational, I won't even say that. It's kids content on things like YouTube that is highly colorful, all CG, very fast cuts, right? And when you watch a show like this, if all you got to do as a parent is count, if you know the language of editing, it's a cut, right? When the camera changes from one angle to another angle, count the seconds, right? And if you can do that, right, what you're going to notice is that between different kinds of shows, you can have a kind of shorthand. A higher quality show is going to have longer numbers of beats between those camera switches. It's going to have less motion, less noise, right? Because what we're finding now is that these tools and techniques of kind of attention grabbing, right? Of holding attention, not because it's good for somebody, but because it makes someone money. We are finding those drawn all the way down into the very young spaces of childhood. And as a result, you have kids that grow up on Cocomelon and who run a tablet all day long and who are playing really short, like often infused with gambling mechanic, free-to-play video games, who, are watching, instead of like long-form television shows and movies, are watching TikTok. And again, it's not about what they're learning as much as what they're learning from the practice of learning. And in each one of these stages, we find that their attention span is getting smaller. Their ability to focus is getting smaller. Their vocabulary is getting smaller, right? Their ability to think past the guardrails is getting smaller. And so again, I really can't emphasize enough for parents out there today that leads us into a kind of very strange trajectory where, again, we're developing a kind of person that doesn't have the kinds of attention span and perseverance, just in terms of security, right? To do the work that we need them to do. I'll ask parents a really mean question, right? And that mean question is, can your kid sit through half an hour of 1970s Mr. Rogers? And if the answer is no, what's changed with kids and brains between now and then? Is it anything? And if not, then what is it that we're doing to our kids and our people that changes those attention spans and mechanism? And I say this really importantly, especially relative to a broader cybersecurity, because that lack of focus, that lack of attention, that lack of ability to slow down and take stock, to be attuned to the fast pace of the information world, right? That comes at a price. And that often comes at a price of vulnerability. That comes at a price of predictability. And all too often now today, it's not the bad actors that I care of as much. It's the ways in which our media platforms and content are engineering a kind of person that is on one hand built for watching more content, but on the other hand, that content is all too frequently things that are, scams and propaganda and active attempts to do information warfare by nation states, right? And so my concern there is that it's no longer simply about what do you do online. It's the way in which our entire media landscape sets us up to be vulnerable. And I think we need to be very cautious about that at much earlier levels and to think very carefully about how our media and communications, we call this a media ecology, right? How our ecosystem of media makes us, right? And as a result, that's what the core of my big concerns now.
Well, Dr. Nathan Fisk, I so appreciate your point of view. I think it was a very interesting conversation. I learned and understand more than I did before. So I appreciate that greatly.
I am so glad to hear that. That is why I do what I do. So really glad to be here. Really enjoyed the conversation. And yeah, thank you so much.
Thank you.